Greetings and salutations, friends and gamers of all stripes. My name is GM Dave. I am your man behind the screen. And today I want to talk to you about the importance of preserving tone in your campaign. Now, recently I've been watching quite a few different things on Hulu and Netflix, as we are wont to do these days. But a couple things that I watched recently really highlighted the importance of working to preserve the tone of whatever it is, whatever story it is that you're working on. Be that a book, a comic, TV show, as is the primary case here, a movie, whatever it might be. The same goes for a tabletop campaign. When you figure out the tone of your campaign, and you should be doing this, you should be at least trying to do this rather, before the campaign starts, and you should ideally have it set by the first session, by the end of the first session, I'd say. I personally think you should have the tone of your game set by the end of the first session. If you don't, making sure that you figure out what you want the tone of your game to be should take one of your top priorities as a game master. And the reason for this is sudden shifts in tone, unexpected shifts in tone, or lack of clarity in the tone of the game you're trying to present is one of the easiest ways to pull your players out of what's going on. It's a very easy way to it becomes a very easy distraction, I should say. And the reason for this is sudden tonal shifts, especially really major ones, can be jarring. What's one good example of this I can think of? Well, there's arguably the most famous tonal shift, the most famous instance of something being so tonally ridiculous, even in a show that already was a little bit ridiculous. That is Happy Days. And I'm, of course, speaking of the incident that spawned the term jumping the shark, the episode where Fonzie literally on a water ski jumps over a shark. As far as I remember, you don't even ever see the damn shark, but yeah, he's on a jet ski, he jumps over a shark, and they make this big deal about it throughout the entire episode, and from that point onward, Happy Days really began to fail. Now, there's a lot of reasons why that was the case there, but one of them was the fact that the tone had shifted with the show. It had gotten progressively more ridiculous, and that moment was simply the moment that cemented that in people's minds, at least in my view. However, and I'm going to go into greater detail later this week on a specific show, the specific series I've been watching that highlighted this point for me again. Preserving the tone of your campaign, being careful to avoid jump the shark style moments, being careful to avoid jarring and sudden changes that feel out of place, is a very important thing to do, because that's going to really define not only how your players approach your game, but it's going to help define how easily they're able to get invested in it. If you as the GM are very unclear as to the tone you want to set with your game, well, then your players aren't going to be clear how they should approach it. Your players are going to have a lot of difficulty figuring out how to approach different situations from a role play perspective, and that's going to lead to the issue of, well, kind of the mixed bag. One example of this I can think of is the Magnificent Seven remake. Now, I admit, right now, I actually really enjoyed that movie. It's not a particularly good movie, but it's entertaining. It's fun to watch. However, tonally, it's a little bit all over the place. And only a little bit. The overall tone of the movie is there, and it's kind of, a little bit of a deconstructive, modern Western, a little more subversive of the tropes of standard Westerns as opposed to praising of them. But there's a lot of instances in which the tone is kind of wonky, and in large part it's due to the acting in that movie. Denzel Washington, who plays the central character, arguably the central character of the movie, he plays his role much like he's in a classic Western. Whereas Ethan Hawke, who's the other really good actor in the movie, all the people in the movie or most of them rather, are good actors, but not all of them made the most of what they had. Denzel and Ethan Hawke did. But Ethan Hawke makes the most of it in a slightly different way. He doesn't really take the classic Western approach. He takes a little bit more of the Eastwood Western approach. He's a little more gruff. His story's a bit darker, and he plays to that. And now, even though their approaches are different between Denzel and Ethan Hawke, they're similar enough that the two are good enough actors that they have a couple moments in the film where there is absolutely fantastic interplay between the two of them. However, then you get Chris Pratt, who isn't really buying into the Western thing too much. There are moments where he does, but there's also a lot of moments where he's just sort of doing his Chris Pratt thing with a Western accent. Or, some variation of it, anyway. Another comparable example would then be Vincent D'Onofrio, whose acting is a little more over-the-top and silly in the fact that he knows what his character is, he has an idea of how he wants to approach it, but he goes over the top with it. He takes it a bit too far. And the other three actors in the movie too, they're fine. I sadly cannot remember their names. I remember the names of two of the characters. I remember Billy, who was I believe he's a Korean actor. I'm pretty sure, yeah, he's a Korean actor, and he was in the film. First time I saw him, and I really enjoy his work. I wish I could remember his name, but the first time I saw him was in the Korean pulp Western homage, The Good, the Bad, and the Weird, which is a really fun movie. And he plays Billy in this movie. I can't remember the character's last name, but he's basically Ethan Hawke's Goodnight Robishaw's partner. And then there is the Native American character, Red Harvest, who is just purely an archetypical American brave, Native American brave. That's all there is to him. The actor who plays him, for playing a character that portrays almost everything he does in the movie with just facial expressions, silence, and I think a grand total of 3, maybe 4 lines of dialogue. He does pretty well. But you can kind of see from my description here that tonally, because of the varied ways these actors are approaching this movie, all very different ways, the movie's a little all over the place. And like I said, ultimately, I still really enjoyed it. I still found it very entertaining. But there's a lot of stuff about it that's pretty messy. And that's kind of reflected in the general sense, or the general opinions of the public, that the remake is just okay. Now, part of the reason for this, I think, is because the director didn't have a clear tone in mind for the movie. He wanted to make a fun, pulpy action film, a fun, pulpy action western that was also at the same time a light deconstruction of westerns. And it seems like that's really all he had in mind. And because of that confused tone, well, you had these very disparate and disjointed performances by the actors. Now, like I said, this is a mild example. There are other instances that I can think of that are much greater examples. And one that immediately comes to mind for me is a movie that came out on the same year. A movie that I still enjoy, but for it being the first of its kind in 12 years, and for me being a lifelong fan of the titular character in the movie, I have to say, tonally, Shin Godzilla was a fucking mess. And the reason for that is because Hideaki Anno, the main force behind the movie, the tone he was trying to set was directly and very negatively impacted by some very tonally off design choices he made that were clearly design choices made because it's cool. These design choices all revolve around Godzilla. And there were some narrative choices as well that also made this problem. Now, Shin Godzilla is meant to be a serious movie. It's meant to be a dark, serious, and pretty much the most politically driven Godzilla movie since 2001's Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All Out Attack. Yeah, try saying that 5 times fast. And in terms of portraying the pitfalls of Japanese bureaucracy and the struggles that people who need to act quickly in an emergency, a serious disaster, have to deal with because of that bureaucracy, and in terms of also being an effective allegory to not only some of the things that happened in Japan during World War II that were not touched on in the original Godzilla, but also things that happened more recently, mainly the Fukushima disaster. The movie does a good job. In terms of its characters, it's weak, but that really doesn't impact the tone in this case. Because it's not an issue of the characters being portrayed in disparate and nonsensical ways that don't quite fit together the way Magnificent 7 2016 was. With Shin Godzilla, the issue with the characters is much more an issue of, oh, well, they're just not well written. They're kind of bland, kind of milquetoast, very archetypical, and you will struggle to remember the names of any of them. To this day, I've seen the movie 3 times now. The only character from the movie whose name I actually remember is the character of Goromaki, the biologist who discovered Godzilla in the movie, and he doesn't actually ever appear in the movie. He's only mentioned. So technically, he's not even actually a character in the movie. He's a guy who's mentioned in the movie, like, twice. The other characters' names, I can't remember them, because they're just plain archetypes. And you know what? That's fine. That's not really what this is about. I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent. The tonal problem, however, comes with the changes that Hideaki Anno made to Godzilla himself. Godzilla's origins are completely changed. His biological makeup in terms of, the fiction of that world, how he comes to be is changed. What he ultimately is has been changed. His abilities have changed. His look has changed. And now his final look, the recognizable Godzilla look, is not that wildly different. It's actually very, very reminiscent of the original 1954 Godzilla design. And it's a pretty effective throwback to that. However, the previous two forms leading up to it are like nothing we've ever seen from Godzilla before, and that's not necessarily a bad thing by itself. The problem comes with what is done with those forms, and specifically what is done with the new abilities Godzilla has. Long story short, Godzilla's place in this movie is very similar, for those of you who know Godzilla anyway, his place is very similar to the place Destroya held in Godzilla vs. Destroya, where he's an ancient life form who, through some, in this case, through the effects of radiation, evolved in such a way that he would consume radiation, it caused mutations, and he grows eventually into Godzilla. Destroya is very, very similar in its backstory. Instead of being basically like... Godzilla, I think, was basically some kind of fish or amphibian that evolved that way. Some sort of sea creature. Whereas Destroya was specifically an ancient crustacean who was affected by the oxygen destroyer that was detonated to kill the original Godzilla. The presence of the chemicals in the oxygen destroyer caused these microscopic crustaceans to alter their evolutionary course. And, throughout the movie, through short periods of time, their abilities change, they adapt, they grow into new forms, so on and so forth, until eventually it forms the final form of Destroya. Godzilla, throughout Shin Godzilla, is evolving and changing constantly. Destroya, throughout Godzilla vs. Destroya, is evolving and changing constantly. So that's one problem right there, is Godzilla's backstory was just taken from another Toho monster that he fought in the past, but he fought in a previous series of movies. However, the tonal, that by itself is not a tonal problem. But it does lead to the tonal problem. The tonal problem comes from what happens because of this constant evolution thing. And this is really the primary new ability of Godzilla, is this ability to spontaneously evolve new forms and new powers. Essentially, it reaches the point where it feels like Godzilla has a God mode cheat code activated, where just on a whim, he can sprout some new ability, just do some new different thing that the humans now have to suddenly deal with, and it's just feels like Anno was able, wrote it that way so that he could just do whatever the fuck he wanted and be as different as he wanted, as much as he wanted. And the first time that becomes clear is when Godzilla evolves from his second form, the one with the googly eyes that looks like a frilled shark, the one that everyone thinks is so cute, into his third form, which looks more recognizably like Godzilla. It all happens on screen. The CGI for it is really bad. And I shit you not, it looks like a giant Pokemon evolution. It seriously looks like a Pokemon turning from a basic form to its middle tier form. And then when he appears again later in the movie, he's evolved already again into the recognizable Godzilla form. Now, one problem with this is the fact that visually, the design work, the animation work looked really bad. Let me change that actually. Let me rephrase that. The design work didn't look really bad. The CGI on the designs of the monsters themselves, of the first couple forms, it's not great. It's good. And it does its job. It's not particularly distracting. It's not great, but it's not bad enough to be distracting. But the animation of the change is definitely bad enough to be a huge distraction. And this is something, it's got a lot of people who are fans of Godzilla divided now. This is not a universal opinion by any means, but for me, that started to pull me out of the movie right away. And then the problem just kind of continued with Godzilla in his more recognizable form, because now there's a point in the movie where he becomes attacked by the American Air Force. 3 B-2 stealth bombers drop bunker buster bombs onto his back because the Japanese bombs and missiles aren't impactful enough to break through the hard, scarred skin that is essentially acting like, metal armor almost. That's how hard it is. So they drop bunker busters into him that explode inside of him and deal a lot of damage. And in that moment, he evolves the famous atomic breath. Now, it's not the same atomic breath that we're all familiar with. It's like a big purple laser now instead of the blue mist or blue beam. He actually breathes real fire for once, which is interesting. Fun fact, all the previous forms of Godzilla, none of them ever actually breathed fire. This is the only one that ever did. But, long story short, he evolves this. And as he's evolving it, he unhinges his jaw to make room for the fire, which, if it was just that, I would have been fine with it. It's like, okay, cool. But then, after he unhinges his jaw, his lower jaw splits open like he's the fucking Predator. And I'm thinking, wait, why is it doing that? Okay, well, maybe he needs to make a lot of space. Maybe this is going to be like a huge flame. And it was a pretty big flame that he spits out of his mouth. So I'm thinking, okay, it's going to be a pretty big flame, so splitting the jaw like that, it's not going to, completely fill his mouth. I was wrong. It did. Which means that the jaw split was purely aesthetic. A purely aesthetic choice. No other in-canon reason for him to do that. It's to supposedly make room for the breath, but it didn't open his mouth any more than having it unhinged did, and the flame was big enough to still fully fill his mouth, even with that split, so it was pointless from the angle of, does this make sense biologically? Does this make sense for this creature to do this? And again, that was another tonal problem. But the big one really came at the final battle. Now, in the middle of this battle, Godzilla uses this atomic breath after it focuses from fire to a beam to cut one of the B-52 or the B-2 bombers in half. The other 2 swing back around to drop their payloads on him. So Godzilla slams his mouth shut and he leans over, and then all of a sudden these beams erupt out of his back. And when I first saw the movie, it felt like, okay, he's kind of overloading on energy now, so he's letting these beams erupt out of his back to discharge it. But that wasn't the case. No, that was another immediate evolution of a new ability. And that was shown in the final combat scene against Godzilla, where the Japanese figure out a plan of how they can defeat him. And in this time leading up to figuring out this plan, they also learned that he has a built-in natural radar that he can detect, that he allows him to detect any movement within a kilometer, a few kilometers of him, a couple miles of him or something, and immediately fire a laser from his back to destroy anything that gets near him when he's hibernating. So that was dumb. But the final battle, the Japanese figure out a plan to beat him, and they're firing massive payloads of light missiles at him from drones to force him to drain away his nuclear energy, because they find out that, oh, if he uses his atomic abilities too much, he drains his energy, and he starts slowing down, and this and that, and he's going to eventually have to hibernate. Well, he immediately opens up by shooting the lasers out of his back, and when they did that, I realized, oh, this wasn't just him being overloaded on energy, that was a new attack that now he can use at any time. So eventually, as he's firing the lasers out, his energy starts to deplete, and he's not able to do it anymore. So a bunch of the missiles start hitting him. And then you see the purple glow of radioactive energy traveling down his tail, down to the big fleshy knob at the end of his tail, and then he jizzes out a laser beam from the tip of his tail. And at that moment, I knew this Godzilla will never be Godzilla to me. This Godzilla is Hideaki Anno taking a bunch of the powers that he gave his angels and Evangelion and trying to shove them down Godzilla's throat in a desperate attempt to seem different and cool and make something new that didn't need to be changed that drastically. And in the end, for me anyway, that jarring tonal shift, that jarring level of ridiculousness really hurt the movie. The exact same thing can happen in your games. GMs, you need to make sure that the tone of your games is clear from the start, because if you can't keep that tone in mind, if you can't keep that tone clear, you're going to have a hell of a time not only getting your players to become really invested, but you're going to have a hell of a time helping them figure out how they should even approach your game. Because if you don't know how to set the tone for yourself, if you don't know how to approach the game for yourself, how then can you be expected to help your players do the same thing? So that's all I've got for you on this subject today. What do you think about this idea that keeping the tone intact and trying to figure out the tone of your campaign in mind before you start, or at the very least by the end of your first session, is one of the most important things you can do as a GM? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments below. And like I said, I will be touching on this again in another Fonts of Inspiration video later this week. And then you will see exactly what it is that I've been watching that had a very sudden and jarring tonal shift, turning what was, for me, a pretty damn enjoyable and overall, while messy, pretty good show into a complete fucking mess and basically a total disaster on the same level of History Channel deciding that history was decided by aliens. And yes, friends and gamers, that is actually a little bit of a hint to what I'll be talking about later this week. So if you like this video, please feel free to leave it a like and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more. Make sure you hit that bell notification button to get notified of when my videos are uploaded. If you do use the notification bell, make sure that it is set to notify all. Otherwise, the system now defaults to only notifying you some of the time when new videos are uploaded. And this goes for all of the YouTubers you are subscribed to. Check that for all of them. If you get notifications from them, if there's any that are your particular favorites, make sure you check that. Make sure you double check that it has been set to show all notifications, because YouTube has made that a manual choice you have to make now. If you want more reliable notifications, though, be sure to follow me on social media. I'm on 4 different platforms. You can find links to all of them in the description down below. With all of that said and done, dear friends and gamers of all stripes, as usual, my name is GM Dave, and it is my sincere hope that you continue to roll high, role play well, and game on. Have a wonderful day.